On June 1st of this year, 2021, I decided that I wanted to get into game design and game development as a hobbyist. I am not someone with a background in game development, and I am not someone with a background in coding. I have a degree in psychology, but I am someone who has been a gamer since I was very young, and I thought it would be really interesting to attempt to learn how to make games instead of just play them. So that said, I decided that I would spend 1 month with each of the two major game development programs, Unity and Unreal Engine 4. And today I want to share with you that journey, those two journeys, what it was like to work with both Unity and Unreal Engine as someone who's never coded before and never worked with game design, and what I was able to learn and accomplish over the course of those 2 months. If you're expecting to see in this video someone who over 2 months just made some incredible games and learned a ton of things and they shipped a product, you're going to be disappointed because the reality is game design isn't easy. It's not something that you can just pick up and learn and master within a 1 month period. But I did learn a lot of cool things and I made one or two cool projects. And I think it would be interesting for other people to be able to see that it is possible to learn how to work with game design from scratch, even if you've never coded before, if you put in the effort. So today I'm going to share with you my journey and what I did to learn how to get into game development as a hobbyist. Let's get into it. My first month of learning was with Unity. I started with Unity because online people said it was generally an easier program to get into, and I didn't want to fight against that too much. So I started learning Unity by going to the Unity Learn website, and I took the Create with Code course as my first step into learning how to code and learning how to work with Unity. This course was a great introduction for learning how to work with Unity as a program and also how to get into C# as a coding language, C# being the main and primary coding language for Unity as a game engine. After the Create with Code course, I bought a Unity RPG course from the website Udemy, and you'll see that come up a few times throughout this video that I went to Udemy to kind of get courses. And that was something that I thought was actually a little bit above my head after the Create with Code course. It was labeled as an intermediate class, but I thought I could handle it because I had taken that first course. I got about halfway through it and it was a little over my head, so I decided to kind of drop that and just start experimenting and learning with things on my own. The biggest learning resource for me as an amateur with Unity was to go to YouTube. And one of the biggest pros of Unity as a game development program is that the community for Unity is rich. There is a ton of YouTube tutorials. There are just hundreds and hundreds of videos and hours that you can watch on how to do specific things and learn specific things on YouTube. For example, channels like Brackeys. A lot of people probably know that one. It's probably the first one that comes to mind when you think of Unity tutorials. These are great resources for learning how to work as an indie game developer by yourself if you don't have a huge team who's going to be able to help you learn how to do all of these complex things. Another thing that I decided I wanted to do early on was try to work with Blender and try to create my own models. I spent about 2 weeks working with Blender alongside Unity, but I quickly decided that Blender and 3D animation and design was not for me as a person. And I can say that it was something that I thought was very difficult and it didn't really bring that kind of spark of inspiration to me. So that's why I decided to maybe drop that and instead work with assets that other people have made. I'm not an artist at heart, so I thought maybe I could do better with more of the coding and design aspect of things. Next, I'm going to talk about the major pros of Unity that stood out to me. But before I do that, I want to talk about my thought process going into this and what I, as a developer or, aspiring developer, was hoping to create. I am specifically interested in making a 3D combat-oriented action game. So something akin to Dark Souls, essentially, Devil May Cry, these types of games, where you have like the camera behind the person, you're in a 3D world, and there's action and combat and skills. This was what I thought it would be interesting to work on. So this is going to influence my opinion on what are the pros and cons of each of these systems. So with that said, here are the pros that stood out to me in terms of Unity as a game engine. So what's the first major pro of Unity? And I think this is one point that I'm really going to give to Unity over Unreal. And that is that C# is a much easier coding language, in my opinion. I spent a little bit of time learning C# with that Create with Code course, and I felt like kind of heuristically, intuitively, I had the basics of it. Like I understood what I was doing. When I first jumped into C++, which I'll talk about later when I go over Unreal Engine, I had no idea what I was doing. C++ is a very complex coding language relative to C#. So I think that C# is a great starting coding language as compared to C++ with Unreal Engine. Now, another great thing, and I mentioned this earlier, another great pro for Unity is that there are a lot more learning resources online from the community because the community is much larger for Unity. You have more YouTube channels, you have more tutorials. If there's a specific thing you want to do, there's a decent chance that someone's already made a video for it on Unity. When I was messing around with Unreal, I didn't have this much success when it came to trying to learn things on YouTube, and I felt like I had to teach myself a lot more things, or go browse some forum online, or go join a Discord server to ask questions, which can be annoying to the people on those Discord servers. The third major point that was something that doesn't really seem important, but it really is when you're working with a coding program for many hours at a time, is compile times. And compile times is how long it takes for your code to essentially load after you've made changes. And Unity can compile really quickly. I mean, within a couple of seconds, really. And you can also compile while you're doing things. So if you're in the game, you have the play mode on and you're messing around and you change the code and compile, there's like a 50-50 chance that it still will work while you're playing. And in Unreal, it just takes forever to code unless you have a solid state drive and unless you're doing some like very specific things. And their built-in compile system will break your code sometimes. So you're supposed to use the Visual Studio or IDE compiling instead of it. And it's just this big mess when it comes to Unreal and compiling. So I give Unity major points when it comes to compiling over Unreal in terms of the basic and natural compiling. What is built into the engine is better with Unity, in my opinion. So I also think that Unity has better innate 2D support. If you're trying to build a 2D game, a side-scroller game, something like Hollow Knight, which I believe was actually built with Unity, then I think Unity is going to be the better choice because they have this nice like 2D mode that you can click, and building user interfaces was really easy. I built a main menu, I built buttons, I built health bars and stuff really quickly following, again, online tutorials that I found on YouTube. And it didn't take me very long to do these things, and it was something that I could accomplish within a few hours of a specific day. Now, another really kind of important, this might not seem important as well, but another thing that I think was important when it comes to Unity was that the asset store was really nice. And if you're someone who is, again, like me, not an artist, someone who doesn't know how to design 3D models, there are a ton of assets on the asset store for Unity, and it's growing. Now, there's also a con associated with that, and that's something I'm going to talk about here in a few minutes, about the size of the asset store and how this can actually be somewhat detrimental as a developer. But in terms of overall kind of quality for the engine, I think that having this asset store with so many assets in it is actually a positive thing. One thing that stood out to me with Unity and C# scripting that I thought was actually kind of nice at first, and it's something that I'm more neutral on now that I've messed with Unreal as well, but there is a difference in how you handle scripts in C# versus C++. So the way it works in C# is that you most of the time have a very highly specialized script for a specific task, and then you kind of like glue that onto the character or thing that you want to have that. So for example, when you have your character model, you're going to have a specific script for movement, but you're also going to have a specific script for input, and then input's going to talk to movement, and then movement and input are going to talk to your character manager script, which is going to handle all the things associated with the character that need to be managed in one place. But you're also going to have a combat script, and you're also going to have, there's just going to be a script for essentially everything, and you kind of attach them to the character model instead of building your scripts around and on top of the character in and of itself. When I was working with Unreal Engine, my character script was essentially a really, really big script that had a lot of things in it. And I would have like one or two components attached to this, one or two other scripts essentially attached to this. Whereas in Unity, I had like 10 or 15 scripts just attached to my character. And some people might see this as a pro and some people might see it as a con. It's a pro because it's really nice to have highly specialized scripts. Essentially, you have a highly specialized script that is meant to do one specific thing. And if you need to fix that one problem, you can go to that one script and find out what's wrong with it. But it's also kind of annoying because eventually you have a ton of things tacked onto your character, and it's hard to keep track of all these things when you have a lot of scripts. And your script list grows much, much faster in Unity and C#. I found that even with smaller projects that I was working on, just things, testing stuff, testing movement, testing character speed, these sorts of things, that I would have like 10 to 15 scripts. And with Unreal, I would have much less. I would have, 5 scripts maybe for the same tasks, essentially. My final major plus for Unity is that in 19 days, on June 19th, I had a small mini-game project made. And when I say mini-game, I mean really mini-game. I called it The Duel, and it was essentially a 2-phase boss fight where you played as a character who had a heavy attack and a light attack. And if you beat the boss's first phase, he would despawn, it would create a second phase. And not only did I code all of this myself, but I actually created the 3D models and animations myself in Blender in a 19-day period from not knowing how to code or ever using Blender or Unity at all to having this kind of small projects made. And I think that really speaks for Unity as a program and how easy it can be to jump in and start doing things and start creating games. And I think that's where Unity really excels, is its ease of access. There's more tutorials. It's easier to learn. There's more courses online. It's really easy to integrate Blender, and it's just easier in general, in my opinion, to actually get into the program and start creating games. Now, I do think that it lacks in some areas when it comes to creating more high-polished games and things that might be in the realm of 3D as opposed to 2D, but I'll talk about that when I get into the cons of each section. So just for right now, though, I do want to say that I think that Unity has a much easier kind of barrier for entry to get through. Like, you can get into Unity to start making games relatively quickly, and I was able to experience that myself, making a project in just 19 days from never coding before. So now it's time to talk about Unreal compared to Unity in terms of the learning journey. Now, I think that Unreal's learning journey for me was much harder because there was much less official content that was organized and structured that was available to me as someone trying to learn the system. Unity had the Create with Code course, and that was something that was provided by Unity, and it was official, and it taught you how to do these things step by step. And it was really intuitive for me to understand and easy for me to attempt to start playing with these things on my own. Now, with Unreal, they do have official learning material, but it's not something that is nearly as organized or structured. And it was much harder for me as a solo developer trying to learn on my own to get through these types of courses and learn things. So I actually wouldn't recommend the Unreal official learning material to someone who's just starting with Unreal as an engine. I instead started with the Game Dev TV C++ beginner course over on Udemy, and I thought that this was a pretty good starting course for learning how to work with C++ as a coding language and Unreal Engine. It's better than starting with nothing, and I feel like if you're going to start learning how to use Unreal Engine, you should try to have at least some sort of course, because teaching yourself C++ is just probably not going to be realistic if you don't have any prior experience with coding. Now, as I mentioned earlier, C++, in my opinion, is a much harder coding language compared to C#. I don't know about any of the other coding languages. So if you're someone out there who's a coder who's going, C++ isn't that bad, well, that's nice. But I'm talking about someone who's never coded before working with these two languages. C++ was much more difficult for me. After I finished this course, I then went on to take their other course in learning how to use Blueprints. And Blueprints is Unreal Engine's visual scripting system. Now, Unity has visual scripting as an external plugin, but it's not something that is innately built into the engine, so I'm not going to talk about that as an official plus for Unity. But Unreal Engine has Blueprint/visual scripting built into the system. And this is something that I think is really great, because if you're an indie game developer, you can make a game without ever doing C++. And I honestly mean that. People will talk about the idea that Blueprints is worse in terms of performance, and they're absolutely right, but this is something that only applies at the kind of AAA level of game development, when you have, like hundreds of scripts and models and characters on screen, and all these things are going to be acting at the same time. If you're working on an indie game, you could make the entire game without ever touching C++ script if you really wanted to. And I think that is a huge benefit for Unreal, and it's something that's really important for people to consider if you want to learn how to use Unreal. Now, that said, I'm actually not someone who uses Blueprint as much as C++. I think I prefer C++ a little bit more, but in terms of the learning journey, learning how to use Blueprint, taking that class in Blueprint was something that was really helpful, because Blueprint, in my opinion, is named Blueprint because it allows you to kind of prototype code. You can quickly try out what code would be like without writing it into your script. So a lot of the times I'll use Blueprint to test and see if some sort of logic would work, and then I'll go back into my C++ script and attempt to write out that code and then get rid of the Blueprint, and then I have the script and more highly optimized version of it available in my script, and I don't have to do it in Blueprint. But Blueprint is great for just trying out code and really getting into things without having to spend too much time writing out the code, learning the syntax if you don't know the syntax, these sorts of things. So let's talk about what I think is the biggest plus for me in terms of Unreal as compared to Unity. And that is that Unreal comes with way more stuff built into the system as opposed to Unity. What I mean by this is that Unity is more like a sandbox where like you can go in and there's no real like expectations or anything set up for you. It's just empty and you can build a sandcastle if you want to build a sandcastle. You can dig a hole if you want to dig a hole. You can do whatever you want, but there's not going to be many tools available for you right off the bat. Unreal assumes you're going to be doing kind of video game type stuff and they have tools available for you. For example, you can start out with a template that gives you a character that can move already, has physics detection, you can alter his movement speed, how many times he can jump, and these are things that don't come innately to Unity. If you want to make a character, you have to build their movement. You have to build their physics from scratch. These do not come naturally. Now, this goes back to the idea that Unity has a better asset store in that you can get these things off of Unity Asset Store. I ended up buying a character mover on the Unity Asset Store for around $50 or $60, I think, because I wanted to have a character who could move around. And after 20 days of struggling, trying to get a humanoid character to move around efficiently, it just wasn't working as someone who was new to C#. It's difficult to build a character movement component in Unity, and I resorted to buying an asset for that. I loaded up Unreal for the first time, and I had a third-person character moving around with the same, if not better, movement in 5 minutes. And it was just because Unreal assumes that you're going to be doing video game things, and they include some of these classes and scripts for you right off the bat. And I think that is something that's really important to think about when you're working with the Unreal Engine, is that there's going to be a lot more kind of video game type stuff innately built into the engine as opposed to Unity. This kind of segues into the hierarchy differences in terms of scripts with the two coding languages and systems. So as I mentioned earlier when talking about Unity, when you are building scripts, a lot of the times you would have highly specific and individualized scripts that you would kind of duct tape onto the character model, and then they would be able to do those things because they have that script attached. Whereas with Unreal, it's not really the same in terms of you usually have one or two bigger scripts that kind of handle a lot of non-specific tasks within them. Like, for example, you might have a skills component that's going to handle all of your skills, and you're going to try and fit as much of that as possible within there. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't have specialized scripts and things, but the way that it works in Unreal and C++, from my understanding as someone who's newer with it, is that there's this kind of hierarchy approach. And that when you want to build a script, a lot of the times you'll have a flat level script, but then you can have a child of that script that is also part of that script's class. So to give an example, you could have a script class called fruit. And in this script, it does everything that a fruit needs to be able to do. So it's going to be able to be eaten, for example. Then if you make a child script of fruit called maybe apple, then it can do things that you would only want an apple to do while still being able to do all the things that a fruit can do because it's a child of fruit. But then you can make a banana child of fruit that's different from apple. So you have fruit, banana, apple. Both banana and apple are fruits, but they're not going to be able to do the same things as each other because they're not related to each other. They're only childs of the parent class. So that you can create these kind of highly individualized and specialized versions of these scripts as hierarchical relatives to each other. And that's a different style of coding compared to C#, in my opinion. And that took some adjusting to. When you first start the game, the first hierarchy example it gives you when you first start the game engine, is that you'll learn what an actor, a pawn, and a character are, because these are three classes that are included in Unreal Engine that you can create right off the bat. And an actor is an object in the world, whereas a pawn is an object in the world that can be taken over and controlled by a player. So you have actor, then pawn. Pawn's a controllable actor. This is something maybe like a car or a ball. And then below pawn, you have character. And a character is a pawn that is meant to be more humanoid and moved around like a human. But character and pawn are actors. It's hierarchical. They are children of actor. So pawn is a child of actor, and then character is a child of pawn. So therefore, character is also a child of actor. And I know this probably sounds really confusing, but that's how C++ coding in Unreal works, is that there's these hierarchical relationships between all of the scripts you have. And that's something that I actually learned to enjoy after working with the program for a while, because it was like, oh, I want to make a weapon. So I would make a weapon C++ class or script, and then from there I could just make a bunch of children that all had the qualities of a weapon but had slightly different variations. So I could have an axe that attacked slower, I could have a sword that attacked faster but did less damage, these sorts of things. And it was something that I grew to like after working with C++ for a little bit. So now let's talk about the elephant in the room when it comes to Unity versus Unreal Engine, and that is going to be graphics. I think you would be hard pressed to find too many people who would disagree that Unreal, I think out of the box, has better graphics than Unity. I think that when you load up the engine and start playing with things right off the bat, it is almost undeniable that Unreal just looks better. It has better innate lighting, it looks more HD, it handles 3D just a little bit better. I think it handles 3D especially better than Unity. Now, this doesn't mean that Unity can't achieve these things, but with Unity, you have to do a lot more work on your own to achieve this higher level of graphics, especially in the realm of 3D. But I don't think that this is going to matter as much when you're working with things that have a more stylized look to them. For example, low poly games or side scroller games. Again, I'll mention games like Hollow Knight. When you're working with these types of games, there's not really going to be any type of difference because the art asset doesn't need to be kind of 3D rendered in this high definition sort of way. So I think that Unreal does take advantage when it comes to graphics overall over Unity, but if you're working with things that are more stylized, you're not really probably going to see this difference, and I won't think it matters that much. Or you could just put in all the extra effort that you need to in Unity to attempt to kind of replicate the Unreal graphics that you would get out of the box. So in terms of final thoughts, what do I think about each of these engines? Which would I recommend, and which did I choose for myself moving forward in terms of which one am I going to spend more time with? Well, for me, I specifically chose Unreal Engine as the engine that I think I'm going to spend more time with after working with each of these engines from 1 month each. And that may sound surprising because at the end of my 1 month journey with Unreal, I didn't have a project ready to present. I didn't have some mini game. I didn't have as much learned in terms of kind of raw knowledge because C++ was a harder language. But at the same time, I also didn't feel like I was fighting against the engine very often. And let me explain what I mean by that. When I talked about Unity earlier, I talked about the idea that it was more like a sandbox and that you could do really whatever you wanted. But at the same time, it starts out as a blank slate and the engine doesn't feel like it offers you as much in terms of things already built into the system. I felt myself resorting to the asset store just for things that to me seemed like they were relatively simple and that I would want already included in a game engine, like character movement, for example. That was a huge one for me. When I booted up Unreal and figured out that I could just have a character that moved around really well and it was really easy to edit these things in terms of contacting the script that handled the management, it was a game changer for me because it was like, oh wow, that's going to save me literally hours and hours and hours every time I want to start a new project and start experimenting and prototyping with things. So for me, it was just nice to have these things out of the box. Now, if you built up a huge asset library in Unity, then you would be able to have all of these things out of the box. Like if you bought 5 or 10 assets that handle all these things that Unreal just gives to you, then you would be able to go, okay, now when I start a new project, I have all these things available and it's going to be the same. But for me, I didn't want to do all that. And to me, it was nice that Unreal just offered those things to me. And that's why I, in the end, think I chose Unreal, even though I think C++ is the harder coding language. I also think that Unreal is just a little bit better for my specific interests when it comes to making a game. I mentioned that I'm interested in making a 3D combat-oriented action game, and I think Unreal handles 3D a bit better. That said, I do think that Unity has a huge amount of pluses over Unreal in a lot of areas, and specifically when it comes to solo indie dev and being able to learn how to code and use this system. I think I would actually counterintuitively recommend Unity to people over Unreal, despite the fact that I, as an individual, chose Unreal for my journey. I think that I would recommend Unity as the engine that you start with and at least spend some time with. And unless you want to do some very specific 3D type of game, I would actually recommend Unity over Unreal just because I think it's so much more accessible, even though you might have to fight with it a little bit off the bat to get some of those beginner things out of the way. But once you learn how to handle character movement, once you learn how to handle physics, all these things, then you'll be able to do a lot of things much, much easier, especially if you're willing to invest maybe $50, $60 to grab an asset or two that are going to help you. So in the end, I do think that Unity is the one that I recommend to people, despite the fact that I chose Unreal as the one that I'm picking for myself. And I think that if I wasn't interested in this specific type of game that I am interested in, that I would probably be using Unity as well, just because I think that it is so much easier in terms of coding and that the structure of C++ coding is difficult when you're working with Unreal. It's just not easy to work with C++. It's difficult. I find myself all the time like fighting against the code, trying to go, how do I do this basic thing? What does this mean? What's the syntax for here? And another huge thing to mention that I didn't mention earlier is documentation. Unity's documentation on how to use their code is just way better. If you go to Unity's documentation, they give you how to write the logic for the thing that you want to do and an example. And that's really useful because you go to Unreal's documentation pages and it's literally just like, here's the logic. There's no example, there's nothing else, it doesn't explain it. Unreal's documentation is really poor, in my opinion, and it's something that you're going to have to fight against in terms of not only learning the system, but learning the coding, because not only is C++ harder by default, but also the documentation is worse. And then C# is easier and the documentation is better. So I know this is probably all sounding backwards in terms of, well, if it's harder, why are you using it? It's just, to me, Unreal was the engine that spoke to me the most after 1 month of using it. And I think it handled my specific needs as someone who's interested in 3D game development a little bit more, even though it's going to have a steeper learning curve. But in the end, I think I would recommend Unity to most people, unless you have a very specific image in mind that you think that Unreal would be able to fulfill better. All right, everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion on Unity versus Unreal Engine. In the end, I really don't think one is better than the other. I think that they just offer different things for different people who have different needs. And you should pick the one that I think fits your needs better. If you're a beginner and you want to do this on a more casual level and you don't want to spend 5 to 10 hours a day learning, I think Unity is definitely the starting place. And then maybe if you've worked with that for a few months, you can try Unreal and see if you like it better. But I would suggest Unity for most beginners who are trying to learn coding, especially if you don't want to invest a huge amount of time into it. I was spending like 5 to 10 hours a day trying to learn how to work with Unreal and C++, and I think that's the only reason I decided to stick with it, is because I had more time than the average person might to dedicate to learning it. So I think that Unity is going to have that much easier learning curve. But let me know down in the comment section below, which system do you use and why? What do you think are the pros and cons that I missed covering the differences between these two systems? If you were going to recommend one system to a beginner, which one would you recommend? If you were going to recommend a system to someone who is more advanced, would your opinion change than if it was a recommendation for a beginner? Why would it change? Let me know down in the comment section below. Other than that, I hope you've enjoyed this video. This has been Asura from Asura Dev. Have a good one.